Good afternoon and welcome to the Spring Gardening Seminar webinar series presented by the Central Oregon Master Gardeners, Oregon State University, and our sponsors. My name is Janet Dart and I will be your host. I'm being assisted by a couple of Master Gardeners in the background. Today our presenter is Dr. Bernadine Strick, and she will be talking to us about producing blueberries and raspberries in our home gardens. But first, a little housekeeping for our webinar. All videos and microphones are off except for the presenters. If you have questions during the presentation, please type in the Q&A window, which you can open from the bottom of your screen. After her presentation, Dr. Strick will address any questions, including questions about any berries, not just blueberries and raspberries. If you have the same question as someone else, please click on the thumbs up icon to indicate you have the same question. The presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the GoComGo website along with answers to your questions. Dr. Bernadine Strick is a professor of horticulture at Oregon State University and is responsible for extension educational programs and the commercial berry crop industries, research, and teaching. She has an active interest and involvement in the home horticulture program and has developed many publications for home gardeners. You received links to some of these publications in your registration email. Dr. Strick is a world-renowned berry crop expert with many scientific research papers and book chapters published. She is responsible for teaching and outreach in consumer and commercial horticulture in the high desert environment of Central Oregon, working with homeowners and green industry professionals. Dr. Strick specializes in sustainable landscape practices, including water-wise gardening, fire-wise landscaping, and backyard food production. Today, Dr. Strick will be talking about producing blueberries and raspberries in home gardens. At this point, I'll return this over to Oregon's very own berry goddess, Dr. Bernadine Strick.
Thank you very much, Janet, and welcome everybody. Let me share my screen here. Okay. All right, can you see that, Janet?
Yes, perfect.
All right, then we are set. I am going to turn off my video. There we go. And well, thank you for that very kind introduction. And my plan here is to cover raspberries first and then blueberries. And I'm going to talk about producing in garden soil, but also in many situations, raised beds or containers might be better, particularly if you've struggled with blueberries, which require very specific soil types. So I will certainly talk about that. And then, as mentioned, I'm happy to address any other questions that come up. And I'll handle the questions on raspberries and blueberries first. So some people love raised bed gardening. This is actually a garden close to, it's in Monmouth, which is close to where we live. And they've made very elaborate raised beds, which include blueberries in the foreground. And then we have strawberries on the side. So pretty cool to see this type of gardening. Whoops. So there's several keys to successful berry crop production. And certainly most berries are really nice landscape plants. But if you want fruit production, which I'm going to focus on here, then you really need a good sun exposure. And for some raspberries, you know, that hot afternoon sun might be an issue in your region, but you can always put some shade cloth over top. Particularly what you don't want is deep shade in the afternoon in particular. We all berries want a soil with good drainage, and the pH, soil pH, needs to be within the required range for the type of berry that you're growing. So I'll talk about that. And then suitable organic matter, I'll focus on that. Not all organic matter is good. It depends on the crop. These have to be irrigated in all production regions. We want you to prune and train properly so you're not disappointed, and I'll highlight those things. And then the other thing I'm going to highlight is fertilizing properly, because pruning and fertilization and soil pH are the three most important things that I see problems with in these two crops when they're grown in the various regions of Oregon. So plants take up nutrients best when they're grown at a soil pH that they're adapted to. Now, almost every berry does well at a soil pH you'd likely find in your region, 5.6 to 6.5. They can even tolerate a bit higher than that. But blueberry is an exception. They need acid soil, and so the pH needs to be between 4.5 and 5.5. So if it's not in that range, for either of these crops, you'd need to modify the soil pH before planting. And I'm particularly going to talk about that when we cover blueberries, because that's the most important one usually that needs modification in your region, which has generally a more neutral pH. Now, this past year, the pandemic year, was a very productive year writing. All of these home garden publications are brand new. They came out in 2020 and include many photos and much more detail than I've had in the past, including native berries, which there are many in your region that can be enjoyed. So you can download these all for free at the OSU Extension website. Also brand new in January 2020 were pruning modules. There's 5 of them, one for raspberry, one blackberry, one blueberry, table grape, and kiwi fruit. So these are, I narrate these. They include videos, and they're specific to North America, including therefore cold hardy tips, which you would need to consider in Central Oregon. So first, let's talk about raspberries. Of course, they can be yellow. They can be black. In the bottom, they're black raspberries, and the red ones we're all familiar with. But what distinguishes a raspberry from a blackberry is the receptacle. It stays on the plant in raspberry. So regardless of whether it's a black raspberry, it'll be a hollow fruit like I'm showing there, where the receptacle stays on the plant. In blackberry, there are maroon colored blackberries and certainly black ones. They are a solid berry. So even if you're picking berries in the wild, you should be able to tell if it's a raspberry or a blackberry. Both are aggregate fruit of many drupelets. Each section of the berry is a druplet, and each druplet contains a seed. So let me just say, there is no such thing as a seedless raspberry or blackberry. It's impossible. Without a seed, there's no druplet. Some cultivars or varieties have imperceptible seeds. Marion or Marionberry is an example of that, but it's not seedless. So the key about raspberries is that they are long-lived perennial plants. They have a pretty extensive root system and crown or the base of the plant. But the canes are biennial. So just like any biennial crop, they will be vegetative, often vegetative in their first season or growing season, and then the following year they flower, and after they flower and fruit, they die. And raspberries are just like that. In their first growing season, a cane or a shoot is called a primocane, and it's often vegetative. There is an exception to this in everbearing raspberry, and I'll talk about that. Then in the second growing season, so once it's gone through the winter and it starts growing in the second year, it's called a floricane, flora being flower in Latin. So floricanes are always flowering and fruiting, and then after they fruit, they die. So other than in the planting year, you're going to see in any type of raspberry, primocanes and floricanes together at the same time. So here is a floricane fruiting raspberry. They're also called summer-bearing raspberries. And this is a photo I took in the spring. So you can see the new primocanes starting to grow, and they are growing from buds at the base of the crown, but also from buds on the roots. And those in summer-bearing raspberries will be vegetative, not fruiting in their first year. I'm also showing floricanes that have started to break bud, and they are producing fruiting laterals, which will bear the flowers and fruit. These floricanes, of course, are in their second year of growth. They overwintered, and once they're done fruiting, they'll die. So of course, we use a term for primocanes that come up from the roots. They're often called suckers. And because the root system of a red raspberry is so extensive, if you're growing red raspberries along your fence, it's highly possible your neighbor also has red raspberries on the other side of that fence. So that can be a disadvantage. Some neighbors would think that was a great thing. But they can be weedy. So having grass beside them works quite well. The other thing that works quite well is pruning them off down deep so that they don't branch. That then you can do that during the growing season. You'll sort of decrease the amount of suckers that you see coming far away from the plant. So in red raspberry, we have summer bearing types, which only produce fruit on the floricane in its second year of growth. So scientifically, they're called floricane fruiting. And then we have a type of raspberry that will produce a crop on the primocane in its first year of growth. It will also, if the base of that cane overwinters, it will also produce on a floricane. And so these can produce 2 crops a year, which I'll talk about. These are commonly called everbearers in nurseries. A little bit of a misnomer. Primocane fruiting is much more descriptive. These cultivars do produce significant crop on the primocane. So this is a screenshot from the new Growing Raspberries in Your Home Garden publication. And I want to point out, this is a key change because I edited these publications working with colleagues throughout the state, including Amy Jo Detweiler, so that we could make sure we included cultivars that were better adapted to your region. And so you can see the USDA cold hardiness zones provided there. The key with a summer bearing red raspberry is that that primocane needs to overwinter. So you have to have something cold hardy enough where the primocanes that are overwintering will successfully break bud and become a floricane. And you need sufficient hardiness for that. So lots of descriptions and some photos of the different cultivars. And I'm happy to answer cultivar questions in later at the end of the webinar. So the key is here, and I need to stress this because, you know, if you know someone growing raspberries, it is easy to dig up suckers with root systems attached and share plants. The trouble is you might also be sharing pests. There can be soil-borne pests. There can also commonly in red raspberry be viruses. So it is better to buy certified disease-free plants from a nursery. And the cultivars in that publication are all available, if not from retail nurseries, from mail order nurseries that are in the Northwest or in the Midwest or Eastern US, for example. So your retail nurseries do like to sell what you want to buy. So it's always good to suggest to them what we recommend and can they get it. So often now the plant I'm holding there is dormant. It's arrived in March. It was in cold storage by a nursery. I ordered it from a mail order catalog, as you might. You can see it has a very extensive root system, and I'm holding the primocane. It's kind of a handle. And I'm trimming the roots because in this case, I am planting it in a large container. And I need those roots to lay flat, the area of the container. So I want the plant to be in the middle. And this is what's different than planting most plants. A bare root raspberry, you'll want to spread the root system out flat. And the reason we do this, remember, is because it has buds on the roots. And so if you plant all those roots deep, then the plant doesn't have the energy to send a new primocane shoot all the way from roots that are deep down. So laying them flat like this, covering with about an inch and a half of soil is the way to plant these, whether you're planting in a container or in soil or a bigger raised bed. Now, in the Willamette Valley, we recommend planting on raised beds because they're very sensitive to Phytophthora root rot. In your sandy soil, this is not necessary. You can see the dormant plant, same kind there. And then in the spring, new primocanes will emerge from the base of that cane, which will become a crown, and also from roots as they grow and develop. So we'll want to plant these 2 to 2.5 feet apart. Now, summer-bearing raspberries need a trellis because you have a longer cane that needs to overwinter. Typically, we'll have one top wire, maybe two, depending on what kind of trellis or training system you prefer. And then we'll have two movable wires at the bottom. And you can see those in the picture on the right because there are chains connected to nails on the wooden end posts, so you can unhook them. Always have a wire tightener because the fixed wires at the top can get slack over time. So you want some high tensile, like 12 gauge high tensile wire that you can tighten when needed. So there are other ways you can connect movable wires at the bottom. And, you know, here's a fence on the left is a fence nail that's partially hammered in only on the one side. In the middle is a special loop that is used by vineyards, and you can buy them at some vineyard supply or farm stores. And then just using even heavier gauge wire, you can make your own loop on a T-post that might be going down the row. Now, some people in a home garden, probably the most common way to grow these red raspberries, whether they're summer bearing or ever bearing, is in a hedgerow. That's a solid row of canes. Because they grow primocanes from the roots, this is usually the easiest way to grow these. The trouble is, many people, specifically if you're managing them well or you've got a good site, the hedgerow, if it's kept too wide, you don't get good light exposure into the center of the hedgerow. So you can kind of imagine that any fruiting laterals that are bearing flowers coming off those floricanes that are growing to the center of the row probably aren't going to get visited by bees very easily. Also, primocanes that are growing up in the center of that row won't be exposed to much light. And that'll decrease your yield for next year because they start forming flower buds in late summer before they go into the winter for next year's crop. So disease management, light management, keep that hedgerow no more than a foot wide for good yield and quality. Now, quite a few people, certainly commercial growers, when you see them, will grow in what's called a hill system. They grow summer bearers in a hill system like this. It's just a little easier to bundle and tie canes, so it's less expensive. Of course, in the home garden, we love working in our yard, so I'm not sure time is that concerning. But that's just so you know, a hill system doesn't mean growing them on a hill. It just means you can see individual plants. So here we are in the spring. So these plants are being grown in a hill system because you can see the individual plants still. And we've got new primocanes emerging from both the crown and the roots. And what we want to do as soon as we can is prune out any of these primocanes that are outside of the row. You're not going to want them anyway. And the sooner you prune them out down low, the better, because the plant isn't putting energy into these and they're not going to end up shading or being invasive in your other plots. Excuse me. So then we harvest. Oh, doesn't that look good? And now after harvest, because these canes are biennial, the floricanes start to die. This is natural. This is not a disease. They're just naturally dying. You can see them in the photo here, and the green canes are the primocanes, and those are really important for next year's crop. So when we go to prune a summer-bearing raspberry, we have to prune out the dead or dying floricanes. Easiest way to do this is to go to the base of the hedgerow or the hill and look for the live canes. The primocanes will be green. You want to leave those and prune out the gray or dying tan colored floricanes. And if you're not sure, just look upwards because these floricanes will have these dying fruiting laterals on them that produce the fruit, and you'll actually see where the fruit was. So it is easy to tell. I get this question a lot, how can I tell? Just look up and move the cane and look and see, yeah, that's a floricane. It produced fruit this year, cut it out. Then you want to tuck the remaining canes, the primicanes, between the wires on your trellis. So you can unhook the wires and pull those primicanes back into the row. We don't want them laying flat or bending over or being moved around by a lot of wind. We want them just to be kept upright like this and leave them alone until after all the leaves have fallen off. I get this question a lot. Can you compost those floricane prunings? Absolutely. There's no disease on those canes that's of consequence if you compost them. So here we are at the Oregon Garden, and the floricanes were removed the prior summer. And this is now winter. All the leaves have fallen off. They do not have two lower wires, so you can see the primicanes are kind of flopping over a bit. We've got quite a few short canes that won't be able to be tied to the trellis and some lying horizontally there. I'll prune those out, and then we will bundle the canes and top them. That's one option. So here we have canes that are bundled and topped. You can top them like this in a hedgerow. This is at about 6 feet tall. If you have that much growth, you can top them. In a hedgerow also, you can individually tie the canes to the top wires. Remember not to tie them to the lower ones because you'll want to be able to move those next summer when the primicanes need to be pulled into the row after removing the dead floricanes. So here's a kitty cat posing at the Oregon Garden. It literally is their cat and decided it had to be in the photo. So this is the plot after pruning. These are growing in a hill system. Individual plants are visible. I've used tie tape. You can buy at a nursery store that's expandable to just wrap the bundles there in various places. And these are arc cane trained, which you can see better in this photo. In the valley, we can get canes as long as 9 feet. So we get a higher yield if we keep a longer cane. And the only way to do that and still be able to pick them is to arc cane train like this. And I find it rather artistic. You can also do this one cane at a time if you have patience, and it looks quite attractive for these summer bearing red raspberries. Now, next spring, we'll see growth on the floricane. So we call it a floricane after bud break. And you can see a fruiting lateral start to grow there, and that will produce the berries. And you get this range in ripening time because the fruiting laterals at the tip of the cane start fruiting earlier, and they start fruiting at the tip of a fruiting lateral and move down towards the base of the fruiting lateral. So let me talk now about primicane fruiting raspberry and how they grow and pruning options. So in this type of raspberry, the primicanes will start growing in the spring. And once they reach a certain height or age of cane, they bloom. So you'll actually get a crop in the planting year. It won't be a huge one because you won't have a huge number of primicanes on such a young planting, but they will start flowering at the tip of the cane, and that will continue to move down the cane. So when we have these primicane fruiting raspberries, they don't grow quite as tall as a summer bearing primicane because they're fruiting. And the easiest way to manage these is to have some kind of a T trellis. You can use rebar with twine running down each side, you rebar with loop in it, making a T. Or you can buy these cross arms that fit T-posts at vineyard supply stores that have like a groove in them, or a good farm store will sell those. And you want to maintain that hedgerow to about 1 foot to 1.5 feet wide. So it can be wider than a summer bearing type. And you can maintain that by tilling them or hoeing out the wider primicanes or just pruning them out, depending on how big your plot is. So they'll start fruiting at the tip of the cane, and then they'll stop fruiting when it gets too cold, when you get some significant frosts in the autumn. So we have two choices on how we can prune these raspberries. We can produce a single crop where we're only getting fruit on the primocane, or we can prune them for a double crop where we get our early fruit on the floricane and our later crop on the primocane. So here, I'm first going to talk about single crop, because many people like to grow a summer bearing raspberry for the first crop, which you'd get sometime in July in your region. And then the primocane raspberries you'd grow for a later crop just before autumn. So this is before pruning. The Oregon garden here did not do a good job of maintaining the row width. They let primocanes just grow anywhere on the bed. So that could have been maintained during the season a bit better. And if we look closely, I always get a question, how can I tell if it's a primocane fruiter or everbearer compared to a summer bearer? Well, primocane fruiters, the tip of the cane will be dead. It'll show these dead fruiting laterals where fruit was produced last late summer, autumn. But the base of the cane will still have buds on it. And remember, the part that flowers and fruits dies. So the tip of these canes will be dead. Whereas in the summer bearers, there might be a tiny bit of the cane, 6 inches or so, that flowered and fruited, but not like 30–40% of the cane. So for a single crop, it's pretty darn easy. We just prune these back to ground level in late winter. This is a great time of year to do it. And you can just use pruners or a weed whacker. Because we don't have a cane that overwinters, cold hardiness zone is pretty irrelevant in your region. You can grow any primocane fruiting raspberry for a primocane fruit crop only because you don't have any overwintering cane. So the primocanes will start to grow, and that repeats the production cycle, giving you that late summer autumn crop. Now for a double crop, of course, the tip of the primocane is fruiting in late summer, autumn. So let me start there. So we'll see the tip of that cane that is fruiting. Now, when we look at it going through the winter, that tip portion will die. So if we don't prune it, you can see the tip of that cane is dead. And the base of this cane is in its second year of growth. So that's a floricane. So it's just illustrating the tip is dead because that's already fruited, but the base is a floricane. So that's where your early crop comes on. The floricane on these primocane fruiting raspberries or everbearers will fruit at the same time as the floricane on a summer bearer. So that'll be your first crop. And then your second crop comes on new primocanes that start growing in this same season. So in the winter, if we're going to prune for a double crop, we just come through and hedge these in late winter again. And we need a cold hardy cultivar, so the base of that primocane is cold hardy enough to produce fruit next year. And this is what it'll look like as a floricane crop. So you can kind of imagine your yield per foot of row is much lower on this floricane crop simply because the cane isn't very long or tall compared to, a 6-foot summer bearing cane. Also, generally, the summer bearers you can buy will have better fruit quality than the floricane crop on a everbearing type. We can talk more about that if you want. So if you're going to grow raspberries in raised beds or containers, it's more interesting to have a primocane fruiting type because you can have 2 crops a year in that container. It's not just vegetative for a long period of time. So raspberries can, despite the big root system, can be grown in a large container. Make sure there are drain holes in the bottom. And you need a good well-drained potting soil mix. You can buy anything that one of your landscape supply places has. That's a good potting mix with good drainage for any ornamentals or bedding plants or vegetable type stuff. You want to plant them 2 feet apart in a raised bed, like in that bottom photo also, just like you would in your garden soil. But remember, they need good drainage. May not be an issue in your area as much as others, but I've seen people build raised beds like that and not think about drainage underneath. And then in a clay loam soil, that raised bed becomes a bathtub in the winter, which is not good. So here I'm growing Vintage, which is one of our primocane fruiting raspberries. And I'm growing them in a 25 or so gallon container here. And I've pruned these for a double crop. I removed the dead floricanes after fruiting, and then the primocanes fruited last late summer, fall. I took the dead tips of those out in the winter. That's what's fruiting right now. My floricane crop here, June 27, is fruiting. And then you can see the new primocanes that are growing up through these floricanes. They will fruit for me in late summer, fall. So I can get 2 crops producing enough fruit for certainly my breakfasts off the one plant. Because it's kind of crowded, you want to thin to the best 3 primocanes. Generally, those are distributed nicely in the pot, those 3, and they're also some of the earlier, thicker ones that come out. And you want to remove any extra ones more frequently during the season. So fertilization for raspberries, there are 3 things to think about. What type of fertilizer should you buy? How much should you apply? And what's the best time of year to apply the fertilizer for raspberries? So first of all, in most garden soils, nitrogen is the most important nutrient that these berry crops need. Raspberries take up the nitrate form of nitrogen. This is different than blueberries, so I'll talk about blueberries separately. And because they take up the nitrate form of nitrogen, that's the most common form of nitrogen in any well-balanced inorganic fertilizer you might buy in a, any garden center. All organic fertilizers like soybean meal, feather meal, cottonseed meal, the nitrogen is all in the ammonium form, but in soils with your higher pH and the pH that raspberries are adapted to, the ammonium in these fertilizers will quickly nitrify to nitrate. And so the nitrogen in those fertilizers, provided the soil pH is good, will still be suitable for raspberries. So in the home garden publication, I talk about the total amount of nitrogen to apply. It increases with planting age, and it differs whether it's a summer bearer or an ever bearer. And the rates are for actual nitrogen. So if you're buying a triple 16 fertilizer, like I give as an example here, that only contains 16% nitrogen. So you'd have to calculate how much product you need to give the right amount of nitrogen. And I give examples of how to calculate this in the home garden publication. So be sure to look at that. And the reason I do that is because there's so many products available, and some have only a small amount, like cottonseed meal, typically 7% nitrogen, for example. So in raspberries, they really need nitrogen in the spring as the new primocanes are starting to grow. And then you'd give your second application about a month to a month and a half later. By late season, typically, they don't need any more nitrogen except if they're ever-bearing type. So look at that piece in these home garden publications. All right, so that's about halfway through the presentation. And so now I'm going to talk about blueberries, gorgeous ornamentals. First of all, they are extremely cold hardy, the ones at Northern High Bush. So they're all going to grow well in your area. There's one hybrid one that will not grow well in your area, and I'll point that out. The biggest challenge you have in your area is soil pH. So modifying soil pH is more of a challenge in many of the soils that you have in your region as well as in Eastern Oregon. But I don't know if you've traveled in Eastern Oregon, certainly Eastern Washington, you see many commercial blueberry fields now, and they're dealing with it, just so you know, by acidifying the irrigation water. So they're still growing in high pH soil, but every bit of water that they irrigate with has been acidified to the proper pH for blueberries. That's hard to do and not practical home garden. So I'm going to give you some tips on how to kind of get around that. So blueberry has 3 key needs soil-wise. Acid soil, 4.5 to 5.5. Good organic matter in the soil for a couple of reasons, and very good drainage. Typically, drainage is not an issue for you in your sandier soils in most of the area, but certainly pH and organic matter are issues. When the pH is too high, you can see symptoms like this of Lyme-induced iron deficiency. So the pH is so high that iron is not soluble in the soil and the plant can't take it up. And so, you know, you'll look at a key, let's say, of this and go, oh, it's an iron problem. It's not an iron problem, that's just a symptom. It's actually a problem that the pH is too high and the plant is not able to take up the nutrients it needs. And the best way and the only way to fix this is to adjust the pH. So the key with soil pH is you can pay a lab. Some master gardener offices are able to test pH, fewer now than used to be able to, but a soil lab can just do a pH test for you and it's not expensive. I'd get a whole nutrient test while I was at it if I'm putting in a long-lived perennial plant, but test the soil pH, generally the fall prior to spring planting. And if the soil pH is above 5.6, incorporate elemental sulfur. You can get that at any yard supply soil store. So it's a prill or a powdered sulfur. The prill is easier to work with. And you want to make sure you apply the right amount to get a target pH of about 5.5. That's at the upper end of the suitable range for blueberry. Fertilizing generally lowers the pH over time, so that's helpful. Give you an idea of the rate. That's for a clay loam soil. If your pH is 6 to 6.5, you're applying, you know, about 4 pounds of elemental sulfur per 100 square feet, and you're incorporating that into the soil. And then it's important to make sure you irrigate that spot if you don't have rain, because it's the water and the sulfur that together make sulfuric acid, which is what's acidifying the soil. And it works very well. But if you've already planted and have established plants on a spot and you go, oops, you know, the soil pH is too high, I'm not having success, then you can either transplant the plants and put them in a raised bed, which I'll talk about, or a container, or you can apply elemental sulfur on top of the soil to bring the pH back down, but you have to do it slowly with very low rates. Now, these are all in the publication, the Home Garden Blueberry publication. You don't want to apply more than 3 ounces of that sulfur per plant distributed above the root zone, because as I just said, you've got sulfuric acid being produced, which means you could burn the crap, not a scientific term, crap out of your plants if you put too much sulfur on. So do this slowly over time. Now, organic matter I mentioned, this is an advantage for blueberry production in more heavier soils, because what happens is it improves the oxygen content around the roots as well as drainage. And blueberries like organic matter. They grow better with higher soil organic matter, like 3-4% organic matter. So what you want to do is to choose an organic amendment that has a low pH and is not salty. So our commercial growers in this region use sawdust, and they'll just put it, center it over the row, and then they incorporate it, and then they'll form raised beds in our region with the heavier clay or clay loam soils and plant into that. The trouble is in home gardens, some of the more common things available are composts as well as manures. And these are not suitable for using as a pre-plant amendment in blueberry because they have a very high pH. Compost and manure have a pH of about 7 to 8, much too high to incorporate for blueberries. They'll do terribly. Also, fresh manures have a high salt, and blueberries and raspberries are sensitive to that. So while you can use compost and manure as pre-plant amendments for raspberry, because they like the higher pH, that's not the case for blueberry. You can use bark, including pine bark. You can use sawdust, wood chips, whatever your landscape supply place has. Peat is much too expensive, and it doesn't provide that porosity that we kind of want in the soil. The other issue we have is soil being too wet. Now, this can happen in a heavy soil, obviously. Notice the horsetails also growing there. But it can also happen if you're over irrigating blueberries in a raised bed or a container. They are not happy when all the pore spaces in that potting medium are filled with water. They need the oxygen. So typically in a garden soil, what we're doing is we're adjusting the pH, making sure the drainage is good, and we're adding suitable organic matter. And in a raised bed or a container, we're building a suitable soil. Often taking your yard soil into a raised bed type production system, while you can add a little of your soil, you really do want to be looking at, making a really good medium for either a blueberry or a raspberry to grow in. Now for blueberry, and they're very well adapted to containers because they have a relatively small root system, but you want to make your own potting mix or check to make sure your landscape supply has something that's equivalent to about a 50% bark, 40% peat moss, and then about a 10% pumice or perlite for drainage. Make sure they've not added any lime, because that potting mix would be acidic, which is good for blueberries. Whereas if they add lime, because most other plants need lime, then it's going to be fine for most other plants, but not blueberry. So make your own. You could make your own if you had to mix it up on a tarp. So one blueberry plant per 12, 25 gallon container, half a whiskey barrel, and put drain holes in the bottom. So the cultivars are described. All of the ones on this list are given in order of ripening. They are all cold hardy enough to grow in your region. And I don't recommend any blueberries that don't taste good. What's the point of growing something with all this work if it doesn't taste good? So these differ naturally in berry size, with the biggest being Chandler in the bottom center, and the smallest being our new one, Mini Blues, which is tiny but incredibly sweet and tasty, which is in the center right column. This one, Legacy, is a hybrid, and it is not cold hardy enough for your region for consistent production. Our winters are getting warmer. It might do fine in some winters, but might not do fine in all winters. And these half highs are extremely cold hardy, but you don't have to grow a half high unless you want a small blueberry plant that produces less fruit, doesn't get as big. They have to have a cross pollinator. Not as critical in the northern, in these cultivars. They will produce fruit if you only have room for one plant, but you'll get higher yield and bigger berries if you grow two cultivars, even in the northern high bush. So the nursery plants that you can choose from are sold generally in the spring, unless you buy mail order, and they're sold with flowers on them. Now, commercial growers are buying plants where most of the flowers have been pruned off, so they don't have to do much. That's not the case for retail nurseries, because retail nurseries say customers buy stuff that's in flower. That makes me the bad person telling you need to prune them off. So the first thing is planting them. You want to plant them at the same depth that they were. So that nursery, if they're in a container from the nursery, plant that soil similar depth to your container mix or raised bed or soil in your yard. They can't stand being planted deeper. So here, this is a chandler, and it shows you the plant, a 1-gallon pot that I bought in a retail nursery. And you can see kind of hard with a white background, but you can see the flowers on the plant on the left. So on the right is after I've pruned it. Notice I have no problem pruning it when it's already started growing and it started flowering. So I'm thinning the shoots or canes, as well as pruning back to the shoots, removing the flowers by doing that. That's really important because you have to be patient. Producing any fruit on these young, small plants will really reduce root growth and shoot growth. So here I am giving a talk in the evening. The 2 plants on the right are 1-gallon containers. And I pruned those just like I just showed you, removing all the flowers, thinning the shoots out a bit. But the plant on the left is a Costco special. And it is, to say it's in full bloom is an understatement. It has a lot of flowers on it, too many if you're planting this in your yard for it to also establish well. So what I'm doing here, I'm about done pruning this plant. So I'm opening up the bush as well as leaving some fruit, but not all. What we want is the plant to establish well. So here's a plant going into its 2nd growing season. I'm just showing you all the growth on this plant if we prune off most of the fruit compared to leaving most of the flower buds on it. So look, these are exactly the same cultivar side by side in the field. It just shows you how much less growth we get when we don't prune enough. So, and that doesn't even show you the root system. So blueberries are mature when they're about 6, 7 years old. So what you want to do from the first planting year to the 6th year is prune to err on the side of less fruit and more growth so that your bush establishes well. And that's always a challenge. In the first planting year, you don't want any fruit. In the 2nd year, you prune to leave a little bit of fruit, because here, this is the 2nd year, too much left, like in the top right photo, will really reduce growth. So that plant should have had maybe half to a third of the fruit that is on there. So it's a challenge. Now, when plants are dormant in blueberry, we can actually see where the flower buds are. They're the fat buds at the tip of last year's growth. And the tiny scale-like buds further down below are vegetative buds, and they'll produce a leafy shoot. So on a dormant nursery plant or a mail order plant that you're getting, you want to remove all the flower buds prior to that planting year. So you get no fruit when you plant. So here I'm doing that here. This happens to be Legacy before pruning on the left. So I'm removing the flower buds as well as thinning the canes. And the reason I do that is because when you thin a bush like that, we encourage new growth from the base, like the whip I'm showing you on the left. We got a new whip growing up there. And also on the bush on the right, you can see we're getting good vigorous shoot growth on those canes that were left, rather than thinner, shorter, spindly shoot growth we'd get if we left the fruit on there. So we're getting much more vigorous growth and better root growth and establishment. And that's really important in that first year. So when we look at a new whip, like I'm showing you here, we see this new whip growing up from the base of the plant. Let's follow that whip. So, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. So here's that whip at the end of the first growing season. It might have some flower buds at the tip, those fat buds. So next growing season, those fat buds are going to produce your flowers and fruit. And then we have new shoots growing underneath those. And those new shoots are really important for supplying nutrients and energy to the fruit so it tastes good and sizes up well. But they're also important because they'll start forming flower buds at the end of the growing season for next year's crop. So when we go to look at this next winter, we'll see the dead skeleton at the tip there. That's where fruit was produced. And then we see those 4 shoots that have lost their leaves and they have fat flower buds at their tip and leaf buds down low. Now I'm not going to prune this. I'm just going to show you what does it look like next year. So now this is that 2-year-old cane growing, and we see fruit at the tip of all of those lateral shoots that were up here. So I don't know if you can see my pointer, but here is my 1-year-old lateral shoot growth at the end of the second year. This grew last season, but we call this 1-year-old wood. And so this is a 2-year-old cane, 1 year and 2 year. And so this 2-year-old cane is now fruiting. And you can see we've got shoot growth underneath all that fruit. Now, next winter, we have a 3-year-old cane. And you can see the skeletons again where fruit were produced. And I'm showing you some of the laterals that grew with fat fruit buds at their tip. Now we go next growing season and we have much more fruit. It's an older cane producing much more fruit. One thing I want you to notice is that naturally on this cane, as it's aged without any pruning, the lateral shoots, the 1-year-old shoots that will produce fruit, keep getting shorter because they're not only competing with the fruit, they're competing with each other. So there's only so many resources this cane can support. So they get shorter and shorter. So if we don't prune, we end up with what we call twiggy growth. This would be, not pruning for several years. We can look closely at a photo like this and we see that our 1-year-old growth is very short. We can sort of against the sky see the fat fruit buds. But this is extremely short. And so there are a lot of flower and fruit buds on this cane. So you'd see a lot of fruit being produced on this cane, but the lateral shoots that would grow below these, they wouldn't grow or they'd be tiny. So the berries would be extremely small and they'd be sour and there wouldn't be good shoot growth. So over time, we have to look for this type of growth and prune it out when we're pruning. Because over time, you end up with bushes that haven't been pruned well, have a lot of fruit, but very little shoot growth. And this isn't sustainable. The plant will end up, sections of the plant will end up dying, and the fruit quality won't be as good. So plants have to be pruned every winter. And in young plants, we want to prune so we get a little more bush growth and fruiting. But once the plants are mature, we want a balance of really good shoot growth as well as good yield and fruit quality. So when we look at a bush, we have to look at what 1-year-old laterals are the most productive. And the best ones are about 6 inches to 1.5 feet long in most cultivars. And the thicker ones produce bigger berries within a cultivar. The trouble is, when you look at a cane before you start pruning, you're going to see all different lengths. And these tiny ones, like my pruners are pointing to, won't produce very good fruit quality, but will still be a drain on the plant. So we have to remove those. So here is a plant going into its 3rd or 4th year. It's not yet mature. And that's the plant before pruning. And because it's not yet mature, I'm going to prune it quite hard. And here it is after pruning. And you can see the 1-year-old wood. It's brighter in color. It's got the fat buds at the tip. And that's, some people think really hard pruning, but that's how you should prune an establishing plant still. And let me give you another couple of examples. Here is an unpruned, and here it is after pruning. Just opening it up more and getting pruning off sections of the plant that have poor growth and leaving better fruiting laterals. One more example here. You can see how much more open the bush is, excuse me, and how you can see the better fruiting laterals, and even the fat fruit buds stand out there. So the basic principles of pruning, including for mature plants, are to prune a weak plant harder. That means removing a larger proportion of the bush than a strong plant. If the plant is weak, it needs to put all its energy into vegetative growth, not fruiting. It'll get weaker if you leave too much fruit. So you have to remove a larger proportion of the bush. Remove any diseased, winter damage, or dead wood first. Thin the new whip growth from the base of the plant to the most vigorous 3 or 4 whips. I'll show you a picture of that. Remove that twiggy growth that I showed you and keep the longer, fatter laterals that have the better fruit growth off of them next season. And you can either remove twiggy growth by removing the entire cane, but look to see if there's something good to cut back to. And I'll show you a picture of that. And open center is always good, and keeping your picking height at a reasonable height, because these things can get tall, is helpful. So we want this balance, good leaves to support this fruit, and we want to look for this during the growing season. Talked about the pruning module, so look at that. For controlling weeds, what we want to do is use a mulch typically, and we have a couple of options. So even in Eastern Oregon, you can use pine needles, you can use sawdust, pine bark as a mulch, and that helps control annual weeds. And you want to make sure you irrigate well. All right, so your irrigating can irrigate on top of the mulch. In this case, we have drip lines here, which is most common. You can use a soaker hose, or you can, hand watering would be tough because in a sandy soil, they need water quite frequently or they'll dry out. You'll see in our region, as well as in Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, they'll use this weed mat, which is a woven polyethylene ground cover, but you have to irrigate underneath. And you'd still need to remove any weeds that are in that planting hole area. Blueberries cannot compete with weeds. They're very inefficient at taking up water and nutrients. So a couple of points about picking fruit. When it's first fully blue, it's not fully ripe. So it'll increase in size about another 20% and in flavor and sweetness as the acids continue to drop. So test that. How quickly fruit ripens depends on the cultivar, but also the temperature during the season when it's fruiting. And the fruit stores really well in the fridge. You don't want to wash it first though, but it stores really well in the fridge. And your yield can be really high on a mature bush in your area as well, if it's growing properly. So birds, doesn't matter where you grow these, birds can be an issue. So I like to net using this 1/2-inch PVC with some rebar stuck into the ground. I don't attach it to the rebar, I just put it over top. And then I have the bird net with some string, just sort of keeping it all together, and a spot where I can go in. And that works really well for me here at home because birds are a pain. I'm going to finish up with fertilization. I'm looking at the time here. I'm wrapping it up. So these 3 things are a common problem in blueberries is not fertilizing properly. And the issue is that for blueberries also, nitrogen is the most important fertilizer nutrient we need to apply, but they need nitrogen in the ammonium form. And most fertilizers that you can buy that are garden fertilizers, quote, are nitrate nitrogen, and they don't work well for blueberries. So the inorganic fertilizers you can buy that work well for blueberries are ammonium sulfate, which is most acidifying, and urea. or rhododendron food. So those are inorganic fertilizers that you can buy in any yard center. And then we have lots of organic options, including soybean meal, cottonseed meal, feather meal, and fish solubles. Fish is tricky because it's a liquid and it's so readily available in a sandy soil. You'd be fertilizing twice a week for a considerable length of time. I talk about what to avoid. Never use fish straight because it's way too salty for blueberries. You'd have to dilute it. You'd attract all the cats in the neighborhood potentially. So look at the publication to see some of the issues you might find with fish. I talked about how you don't want to amend the soil prior to planting with compost, but compost is a good slow release nutrient source, and you can apply it as a light mulch every couple of years on not too deep on top of the in the row area to serve as one source of fertilizer. But of course, weed seeds, when they blow in, can germinate very quickly in a compost. So just watch out for that. The amount of nitrogen a blueberry bush needs increases with planting age because it's affected by how big the bush is. Bigger bushes need more nitrogen. So you'll see that the total rate I have in that publication is by plant age from 1 through 8, saying when they're mature, they need about this much consistently. And of course, you have to calculate how much product to apply depending on what you want to use. With blueberries, they need their nitrogen in the spring. And typically, we want to fertilize for the first time just before bloom. And then we apply, so we divide the total rate into thirds. And the first third is around here in the valley, it would be about mid-April to late April. We'd be applying an organic product. An inorganic, like ammonium sulfate, we would apply at the end of April. And then we'd apply the second third about 4 weeks later, and the last one about 4 to 6 weeks after that. And then we're done fertilizing, so the plants can, start to not just harden off, but form good flower buds for next year. And I'll finish with this photo, one of my favorite ones of Vaccinium ovatum, the evergreen huckleberry, which is one of our native blueberries. There's also many in the Cascades that I'm sure we've all enjoyed eating, native blueberries on the Oregon coast. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open it up for any questions that we have. All right, so I'm going to click open the questions here. And I'm going to go at the top here. First one is, would chopped pine needles be a good organic amendment for blueberry soil? We have a lot of those. Yes, you do have a lot of those. Yes, they would be fine. The only issue with using pine needles as an amendment is that they would break down relatively quickly. So for the longer term benefit, you might want to go with like a pine sawdust or a pine bark, which would last a bit longer. But they're pine needles, bark, and wood are all a pH of about 4, so that works quite well. Coffee grounds, would they be a suitable amendment for blueberries? I always love this question because, boy, you're either a coffee roasting business if you had enough to be able to do that. They'd be all right. They are often, I get questions about whether or not the coffee would be a fertilizer. It's extremely low in nutrients, coffee. They are on the acidic side, but there are better amendments that would do more benefit to the soil. Let's see. Okay, small bed on either side of a walkway, but adjacent to a sidewalk. This is a really good question because this is a common thing that I see, especially in city plantings, where you'll see, those of you who are familiar with Sunshine Blue, which is an ornamental blueberry. Um, in the city, it's often two things wrong. It's not pruned, which is unfortunate because the beauty of Sunshine Blue is its leaf color, shoot color, and of course flowers and food for birds in city landscapes. But they don't prune properly. And then secondly, right beside a sidewalk or concrete sidewalk, generally that is high pH soil because the lime in the concrete is leaching out over time. So it's very difficult to maintain a low pH soil along a sidewalk. So that would be my big concern there, where building a raised bed so that you're raising the blueberries beside the sidewalk, that would be fine. As long as you're, have a soil like we talked about, that would work. Then you kind of have you could make a nice walled structure and grow them that way. Is it okay to prune blueberries now? The big answer is yes. It is. If you haven't pruned, please prune. Or if you don't think you've pruned enough, please go back and prune, because the only disadvantage to pruning after bud break is that when you pull some wood out, you might pull some flowers off, which would be an additional pruning. But they really need to be pruned well. And don't be afraid to prune, and don't be afraid to experiment. So if you have more than one bush, go, okay, I'm going to prune this one harder, what you think is harder, and this one kind of like what I've been doing. And then look at the difference during the growing season. That's how you learn. And then you can adjust things accordingly next winter. Based on what you saw. So don't be afraid to do that. The worst thing though is to not prune, because they'll go downhill pretty quickly. Let's see, next one here. We have Tulamine raspberries, and they're not on my list. Let's see. Any reason they weren't included? They are raspberries in general, first of all, I love this, eating on the wild side is high in nutrition. All berries are very high in nutrition. So I just love my job. Oh my gosh. Needless to say. So Tulamine, not in particularly more, it's just they're all really good. But boy, Tulamine is one of the tastiest raspberries. The one that comes close, Tulamine's a summer bearing type. The one that comes close is Cascade Delight. The reason I didn't include Tulamine is I could not find it for sale. And there's nothing that frustrates people more with a new home garden publication than if I'm recommending stuff you can't find. Now, some of our newer stuff like Mini Blues is hard to find, but if you order a year in advance or get on a waiting list, you can find it. But Tulamine is an older variety from British Columbia. It's named after the Tulamine River, which is named after the indigenous peoples. And it is really tasty, but getting harder to find. In the Willamette Valley, it's very sensitive to root rot. So it has to be grown in containers, not an issue in your region. So if it's growing well, man, you're lucky to have it. So yes, start pruning it as I described for summer bearers. Let's see. Western fence that gets morning and some noon sun, and an eastern fence that gets mostly afternoon sun. Would either of these spots in Bend grow raspberries successfully? I would say either of those would, because when you guys get sun in Bend, that's intense. I would say if I had to choose, I would prefer the one that gets all morning sun when it's cooler, as well as some noon sun. I think your raspberries would do better in that situation than if they only got sun on the hotter part of the day, which a raspberry is a temperate crop. So when it gets really hot, they kind of shut down for the day. They close their leaf pores or stomates, and they're not growing as well. But if one is way more windier than the other, I would choose the one that was less windy, because raspberries are sensitive to wind. Oh, Are deer a problem with either type of berry? Deer are a problem with every berry. There isn't a single berry deer won't like. And the trouble with some of these is the deer will taste it and there goes like a strawberry. I have to chuckle when I see tulips on the deer resistant plants. Well, they hate the leaves. They won't touch the leaves, but they eat all the flower buds off. So what's the point in growing a tulip? So you do need to keep deer out, unfortunately. They will munch on the fruit of a blueberry as well as the shoots. They don't like it. If you see them here in the Willamette Valley, deer are eating all the thorny Himalaya blackberries. So even thorns don't bother them. All right. Okay. So let me table the one on blueberry, details on blueberry pruning for a moment. Are worm castings helpful in any way? They are, of course, it's a form of fertilizer. It's a rich product in the sense that it's, you know, kind of like a low salt fecal product. So it's, I guess I'll call it a manure, but it's just that it's a small quantity. So for larger plantings, it's an issue. Pelletized chicken manure is commonly available. It can be used in berries, but in blueberries and in raspberries, make sure that it's not right up against the base of the plant because it can literally burn. As water is absorbed by even that pelletized chicken manure, that there's a high salt content there. And I've seen young plants die when pelletized chicken is touching the base of the plant. I have a lot of moss around one of my plants. Is this good? Well, the moss will indicate, typically you get moss when the pH is a bit low, which is interesting, and when it's moist. Moss is, I would get rid of moss simply because it is preventing water from moving easily to the plants and certainly fertilizers. So I would get rid of the moss. The only space I have is on the north side of a house. It gets late afternoon sun. How many hours a day do blueberries need? That's probably not enough sun for any berry crop to do well. Because the sun is also needed for photosynthesis and having sweet fruit. A common question I get on any crop, particularly strawberries here in the valley, is how come my strawberries don't taste any good? Well, it's because we've had nothing but cloudy, rainy weather for these first 2 weeks of strawberry season, and they don't get sweet. Same thing happens in the shade. They won't taste as good. You'll get some fruiting and production, and I guess some is better than none, but you might want to consider growing in containers in a better spot in your yard if you have space. That's an interesting question. Early blue and blue crop together. Early blue have done well. Blue crop haven't done well. Is blue crop more sensitive to pH than early blue? There are differences between cultivars to tolerance to pH that's out of that range. Let's say it's a bit high. It is possible. Early blue is not grown commercially anymore. It's very difficult to get now. Generally, you'd expect the opposite. Blue crop is generally more tolerant to things than early blue, so I'm a bit surprised by that, but it is possible that it's a pH issue. So just check your soil pH and see if you can fix that. As a HASCAP question, which I will table. For now, how close can I plant hedgerows of blueberry and raspberries? Well, think about a couple things. One is they have different soil pH requirements. So you would need to be able to keep the soil amendments separate. Also, something to think about, raspberries are very invasive. So if you had a red raspberry row, the roots would be growing under the blueberry plants for a fact, and therefore you would have raspberry weeds within your blueberries. The reason is raspberries are more tolerant of low pH than blueberries are of high pH. So I would not put them that close together because you'd have a heck of a time weeding all the time your raspberries out of your blueberries. Also, raspberries and blueberries could shade each other. So I think that would be an issue I'd also worry about. Okay. Can blueberry canes be rooted as in propagation? Be aware that some cultivars are patented, so you're technically not allowed to propagate your own on a patented cultivar, and that's evident in nursery catalogs, like Mini Blues is patented, for example. Some are very difficult to propagate by hardwood or softwood cuttings. Most are now grown by tissue culture by large wholesale nurseries and grown on by other nurseries to provide you with a very good plant that's also disease tolerant. Now I've tabled, can I plant strawberries around blueberries? Strawberries have a higher pH requirement than blueberries. So they generally don't do well together. If one's doing well, the other's not. So I would not plant strawberries around blueberries and expect your blueberries to do well if your strawberries are doing well. So when they have different soil requirements for pH, that becomes problematic. Okay, so we have a Marion question. We have one that's close here on blueberries. What's the difference between, this is one of my favorites. I don't know if any of you heard my OPB interview on huckleberries. Huckleberries are actually native blueberries. And for any of you who have grown in the eastern part of, grown up in the eastern or spent any time in the eastern US, you know what a true huckleberry is. It's a different genus, Gay Lusacea. And Gay Lusacea, it looks like a blueberry, but it has 10 bigger seeds inside. And they're tasty, but they're not blueberries. Nor are our native huckleberries huckleberries. They are the genus Vaccinium, and so they're native blueberries. So that's just, common names can be very misleading. There are lots of native huckleberries that are in your area, including the red-fruited huckleberry, which is tasty. The birds usually get it first. And then some of the, probably one of the most common is the mountain huckleberry, which I'm munching on whenever I can. Very prevalent in the Mount Jefferson Wilderness area. And question that was asked is, can you grow them? You can buy these from native plant nurseries. The trouble is they're just not adapted to the climate, or what's the word I'm looking for? The whole, drawing a mental blank. So you're in your yard, it's not just climate, it's also the surroundings. It's the organic matter in the soil, the other plants that are present providing organic matter. When you hike, you'll see these as an understory and mottled light. And that's what they're adapted to. And the other thing you'll notice, you know, when I'm hiking in these areas, in fact, late last summer in the Mount Hood Wilderness, I made a note of what elevation I was at when I saw mountain huckleberry, Vaccinium membranaceum, for the first time, and it was at 2,000 feet. And then when I went higher, it stopped fruiting at about 5,500 feet. So they're adapted, and they're adapted because in that climate zone, they have different winter chilling, and they have different summer temperatures. It's cooler than the heat you'd have, let's say, in Bend. And also, if the soil is different, it's naturally acidic. That volcanic soil is naturally acidic. They're not very productive, but boy, do they taste good. So I'd enjoy them in the wild personally, rather than growing them in your yard. So can I post again where you can get the information on raspberries and blueberries? For any of you, if you Google growing, insert the crop, growing blueberries in your home garden, Oregon, the link will pop right up for these OSU Extension publications. So growing raspberries in your home garden in Oregon, that'll pop up. And you can type in pruning modules for berry crops, PACE, P-A-C-E, all caps, and those will pop up also if you have trouble searching. Marionberry bush, now 2 years old, is the same recommendations for raspberry, the same for Marion. The short answer is it's similar. Marion is a trailing blackberry that is summer bearing, so it's similar pruning to the summer bearing red raspberry. Soil requirements are similar, but Marion's not very cold hardy. So I would Google growing blackberries in your home garden in Oregon, because I actually give tips for the home gardener. If you want to grow Marion and Boysen in your home garden in Central Oregon, you're going to have to protect in the winter. So I give some tips on how to do that. So look at that there. Haskaps. Haskaps are extremely cold hardy. That's Lonicera caerulea, or the honeyberry. Haskap is a great term to use. It's the Japanese name for this where it's native. They are, I think that Dr. Maxine Thompson, she recently passed away, 93, right up to her last days, she was breeding Haskaps with Japanese cultivars or selections. There are Russian Haskaps. I find those are more acidic and less tasty than the Japanese one. You can actually Google Maxine Thompson. It's Thompson, and there'll be links to the cultivars that she produced that are also available through mail order nurseries. You need a pollinator, so they'll recommend a couple of cultivars. They are extremely cold hardy. You can grow them in your region. I have them in the yard here and they're flowering right now, and they fruit before my June bearing strawberries. So they fruit very early. Keep the birds off because birds love those things. Now, there was a question that I had tabled about a little more detail on pruning. And because in this talk I was only covering, I was covering 2 crops, I wasn't able to go into too much detail on pruning. If you're really confused about pruning, or if you're having success getting really good growth on your blueberries, the investment in the pruning module is I would say really good. I know it's $50. You have access for a whole year. Go back as many times as you want, so you could use it this year as well as next to refresh your memory. I show videos of how to prune as well as pictures of all these cutting back terms. The short answer is look for twiggy growth. Anything that's clearly dead, prune it out. Look for twiggy growth and go back to where you see good growth. That's last year's growth, good laterals with good fruit buds, or a new shoot coming up from older wood. Cut back to that. That's at least what I would do right now if you haven't been pruning well. Let me see if there's any other last minute questions. Let's see. What's the difference between blueberries and huckleberries? I think I covered that. Let's see. Covered those. Just scrolling down here. Is any last minute questions? Are there any good companion plants for blueberries to grow as a ground cover, or is sawdust, bark, wood chip mulch really the recommended way to go? The latter. Anything that grows another plant is going to compete with blueberries. Blueberries have a very shallow root system. They only go about 1 foot deep, even in sand. And most of their feeder roots are at the top. They like high organic matter, and any weeds or any other plants that are growing in the row, that means under the drip line of the bush, are going to compete with the plant and reduce root growth and shoot growth. So I wouldn't grow anything in the row. Beside the row is perfectly fine. That's also a plant that can tolerate low pH particularly. Strawberries can tolerate that lower pH if you've had success keeping the pH low in your blueberries in soil, then strawberries can tolerate that pH, not the other way around. Blueberries need the acid soil, so that's helpful. And then the last question, it looks like, is, can I recommend a few varieties that ripen at different points in the summer? I'm not sure which crop, but I do give range of ripening times in those home garden publications, because obviously that's ideal where we have varieties ripening at different times. So I think you can find that there. All right. Any last minute questions? I think I've covered all the ones I see here.
I think that was excellent. I appreciate you spending the time with us, and I appreciate everybody that hopped on with us. I can't believe how much I have to learn. I just have to keep saying that. I just want to take a moment and, oops, hit the right button. Take a moment and thank everybody for showing up and asking questions. We do have a survey that's going to pop up at the end of this, and we hope you will take that. Just gives us a little information about what else you'd like to learn. And you will get a follow-up email. There's 4 publications that Dr. Strick has referred to that she worked on this year, and you will get links to those in that follow-up email. I think you got them already, but Zoom gives you so much information, it's nearly impossible to find what we were trying to sneak in there. And just wanted to give a thank you to our sponsors and give a plug for our silent auction that is going on currently. There's a link for it there, and you'll also get that link at your follow-up. So thank you very much. I think we have no more questions, and we're going to call it today. And
thank you, everybody. And thank you for hosting.
Thank you, Brandine.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.
Have a great rest of your day.
Janet. Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Strick.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Janet.